I shouldn't be telling this story with my real name attached to it. Not because I'm afraid of getting in trouble for what happened on that stretch of Missouri highway, but because every time I try to explain it out loud, something small in the world seems to disagree with me. A light flickers. A door that was shut is suddenly open. A shadow falls where it shouldn't. Not real. Not real. I've replayed that traffic stop so many times in my head that it doesn't feel like a memory anymore. It feels like a recording that keeps getting corrupted. Like somebody's rewinding the same tape and wearing the truth thin. And before I go any further, I need you to do one thing. If you want the full confession, if you want every detail exactly as it happened, don't skip ahead. Don't jump around. This story doesn't survive being rearranged. It only makes sense in the order it happened, and even then, I'm not sure it makes sense at all. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Your room, your car, a late night shift, a phone under your blanket while everyone else sleeps? Drop your location in the comments. City, state, country. I read them. I need to know how far this thing has reached. And if you're new here, subscribe before you keep listening. Not because I'm chasing numbers, but because if anything happens to this account, if this recording gets deleted, if it vanishes the way other things have vanished, you'll know it wasn't an accident. You'll know it was taken. Now listen closely. I was Missouri State Highway Patrol. Night shift. Rural routes. The kind of roads that look normal in daylight and wrong after midnight. Long, straight lanes that cut through trees and fields like somebody carved a line into the state and forgot to fill it back in with noise. That night, the air was heavy. Late summer humidity that sticks to your uniform. The windshield fogged at the edges even with the AC running. Insects used to be loud out there. You'd hear them through the glass, through the radio, through your own thoughts. But that night the road felt muffled. Like the world had been padded. Sound was trying not to travel. Not real. I was somewhere outside the small towns nobody mentions unless they have to. The ones. A gas station, a church, a dark water tower, and then miles of nothing. Dispatch was calm. My unit was clean. My coffee was still warm. I remember that part clearly because later I started doubting whether anything I remembered was mine. I was doing what we always do. Watching taillights. Looking for drift, tracking speed, all the boring pieces that keep you alive. The highway was mostly empty. A few semis in the distance like moving buildings, a pair of headlights far behind me. Everything steady. Then I saw him, a sedan ahead of me. Dark color, maybe gray or black. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't weaving wildly. It was doing something worse. It was drifting as if the driver was listening to something inside the car instead of watching the road. Not swerving, not panicked, just late. Every correction came half a second after it should have. The driver wasn't reacting to the lane lines, but to a memory of them. That's what made me turn on my lights. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it could be fatigue. Could be intoxication, could be an older driver, could be a medical issue, could be normal. Red and blue filled the night. The cruiser's light bar bounced color off the asphalt, off the roadside reflectors, off the metal signs that warn you about deer and curves and things you think you can avoid if you see them early enough. The sedan pulled over immediately, too immediately, like it had been waiting for the lights. The car rolled to the shoulder and stopped perfectly straight. Perfectly placed. Not a sloppy stop. Not a nervous stop. It parked like someone setting a piece on a board. I radioed in the stop. Location. Vehicle description. Standard. The radio clicked back with nothing but a thin wash of static that cleared after a second. It happens out there. Dead zones, trees, humidity. No big deal. But when I stepped out of my cruiser, I felt the quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet you get in the country. Not the peaceful kind. This was a quiet that felt intentional. The insects were gone. The wind was gone. Even the distant trucks sounded too far away, like they were moving through a different night than mine. I walked up behind the sedan with my flashlight low, training and muscle memory carrying me forward. My boots on the gravel shoulder sounded louder than they should have, each step too crisp. And then I saw it. It was just a stupid detail. The kind you don't notice unless you're trained to watch everything. My headlights and spotlight were hitting the driver's side of the car at a clean angle. Hard light, bright enough to carve shapes out of darkness. It threw the cruiser's shadow across the lane. It threw the grass's shadow into the ditch. It made the signpost's shadow long and thin like a finger pointing away from the scene. Everything had a shadow. Everything except the driver. He sat there in profile, hands on the wheel, head angled slightly forward like he was listening to the engine idle. And under that harsh light, with all of those shadows laying across the world like proof it was real, the man had no smear on the door, no shape on the pavement, no dark edge under his chin, nothing attached to him. I stopped walking without meaning to. My brain tried to fix it instantly. Angle, glare, window tint. Something about the glass, something about the seat position. I shifted my stance to the left, then to the right, like my body could solve the physics problem. Still nothing. Not real. Real. Not real. I leaned slightly, just to see if maybe the shadow was hidden under the car. The car had a shadow. The tires had shadows. The undercarriage had a shadow. The man did not. And that was the first moment I felt the instinct I've learned to trust more than policy and training. The instinct that says, leave. But I didn't, because that's not what you do when you're wearing the uniform and you're alone on a highway and you're trying to stay rational. You don't leave. You approach. So I approached. I kept my voice steady. My hand rested near my holster, not because I felt threatened by a weapon, but because my body didn't know what else to do with fear that didn't have a shape. I reached the driver's window. It was rolled up. The glass was dark, but not tinted the normal way. It looked like the inside of the car was darker than the night around it. I tapped the window with 2 knuckles, a normal, polite tap. The window rolled down slowly, not stuck, not squealing, just slow. And when it opened, the air that came out of the car was cooler than the air outside, like the sedan carried its own weather. The man turned his head toward me. He looked normal. That's the part that still upsets me. If he'd been monstrous, if he'd been obviously wrong, my mind could have labeled him and moved on. But he looked like someone you'd pass in a grocery store, middle-aged, pale but not sickly, no strong smell of alcohol, no wild eyes, just a calm face and a smile that took a second too long to arrive. "Evening, officer," he said. His voice was polite. His words were correct. His timing was off. The greeting had been rehearsed. I asked for license and registration. Standard. Routine. A script that keeps you from thinking too hard. He didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't look around for paperwork. He just held my gaze and said, "I'm heading home." It didn't sound like an answer. It sounded like a statement he needed me to accept. I repeated the request. He blinked once, slowly, then said, "I was heading home." Same tone, same calm, slightly different. Not real. Real. Not real. I asked again, firmer. He smiled again like I'd said something funny, and he said, "I will be heading home." That's when I noticed something else. The interior rearview mirror should have caught my light, should have flashed a reflection, should have shown the angle of his face, but the mirror looked blank. Not shattered, not covered, just blank, like it didn't know what to reflect. I felt the skin along my arms tighten under my uniform. I told him to keep his hands where I could see them. He complied, hands on the wheel, fingers still. I asked him if he knew why I stopped him. He answered without hesitation, "Because you saw me." That wasn't a normal answer either. I should have stepped back right then and called for backup. I should have returned to my cruiser and watched from a distance. I should have done 100 things that would have looked smart in hindsight. Instead, I stood there in the light, staring at a man who didn't cast a shadow, while my own shadow lay behind me like it was listening. Not real. Real. Not real. I glanced down once more, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. The pavement was lit like a stage. My legs cast a shadow. The car cast a shadow. The grass cast a shadow. The man cast none. And then the radio on my shoulder gave a soft burst of static. I waited for dispatch. Instead, through that static, I heard something that sounded like breathing. Not my breathing, not his. Something closer to the mic than it should have been. And the driver's smile widened just a fraction, like he heard it too. I've rewritten this part more times than I want to admit. Every version sounds like I'm exaggerating, like I'm trying to dress up a routine stop into something mythic. That's not what this is. I don't need it to be dramatic. It was quiet. That's what made it wrong. When the radio released that thin breath of static, I stepped back from the window and pressed my shoulder mic. I gave my unit number again, gave the mile marker, gave the vehicle description. My voice sounded normal in my own ears, steady, trained. I've handled worse situations with less control. There was a pause long enough to notice. Then dispatch answered. Calm, clear, ordinary. They confirmed my location. Asked if I needed backup. I almost said yes. The word was sitting at the back of my throat, but I looked at the man in the driver's seat and saw nothing overtly threatening. No weapon, no sudden movement, just that same patient smile. I said I was fine. Not real. Real. Not real. When I stepped forward again, the night felt thinner, like the air had been stretched. I could see the tree line in my peripheral vision, dark and still. No wind in the leaves, no insects buzzing near the headlights. Even the humidity seemed suspended, as if it had decided not to settle on anything. The man's eyes followed me without his head moving. That detail came back to me later. The way his gaze tracked first, and only after a delay did his neck turn. I need your license and registration, I said again. This time, he nodded once. Slow. His right hand left the steering wheel and moved toward the center console. I watched closely, posture angled, light steady. He opened the console. Inside was nothing. No papers, no wallet, no clutter. Just darkness, not shadow. Darkness, a depth that didn't reflect my flashlight. He reached into it anyway. His hand disappeared up to the wrist, as if the compartment were deeper than the car's frame should allow. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my stance. He withdrew his hand and placed a driver's license between two fingers, holding it up for me to take. It looked normal. Missouri State ID, lamination intact. No obvious tampering. I took it. The plastic felt cold, colder than the air. I glanced at the name, then the photo. The photo showed the same man sitting in front of me. But in the picture, he had a shadow, a faint outline beneath his chin, cast against the DMV backdrop. I looked up at him, then back at the card, then down at the pavement beside the car. Nothing. Not real. Real. Not real. You live nearby? I asked, more to fill the silence than because I expected useful information. Yes, he said. The word arrived immediately. Then, after a pause, he added, Close enough to what? I didn't ask. Where are you coming from tonight? He blinked. From being seen, the way he said it felt like an answer to a different question. My training told me to disengage emotionally, keep it procedural, control the stop. So I stepped back, license in hand, and walked toward my cruiser. My own shadow stretched long in front of me now, thrown by the headlights. It looked normal. Solid. Attached. I checked, more than once. I opened the driver's door and slid inside. The cabin felt warmer than before, like it had been sealed too long. I placed the license on the console and began typing the information into the system. The computer responded slower than usual. Small delay between keystrokes and letters appearing. The name on the license was plain. Nothing remarkable. The birth date suggested mid-40s. Address a rural route not far from where we were. I ran the plates from memory, then checked the screen again to confirm. The system didn't populate. I frowned and tried again. Still nothing. The cursor blinked in the empty field as if waiting for me to realize something. I pressed my mic again and requested confirmation from dispatch. This time, the response took longer. Static washed through the speaker, not loud, but layered. Beneath it, for a split second I heard something that didn't belong in a radio channel. Breathing. Measured. Close. Then dispatch came through, crisp and professional, saying they had no record of the plate number I provided. I repeated it carefully. They repeated their answer. No record. That's not possible, I said quietly, more to myself than to them. The sedan was still there in my rearview mirror. Engine idling, driver unmoving, everything about it looked real, not real. Real, not real. I asked dispatch to run the driver's license number instead. Another pause. Longer this time. When the reply came, it was different. They said the license number belonged to a man reported missing 8 months ago. Same name. Same birth date. Last seen not far from this highway. I stared at the computer screen. I stared at the photo on the card. I stared at the man in my mirror. He hadn't moved. Can you confirm status? I asked. Dispatch told me the missing person case was still open. No updates. No confirmed sightings since the initial report. My mouth felt dry. Are you sure? I asked. They sounded slightly confused now. Yes, officer. The individual is listed as missing. Why? I looked at him again. He was watching my cruiser. Watching me. Even from that distance, I could see the curve of his smile. I swallowed. Stand by, I said, and lowered the mic. For a moment, I considered calling for backup. Multiple units. Lights flooding the road. More eyes to confirm what I was seeing. But another thought pressed harder. If he was listed as missing, and he was sitting right there in front of me, then something about this wasn't procedural. It wasn't paperwork. It wasn't a simple error. It was something that didn't want witnesses. Not real. Real. Not real. I stepped out of the cruiser again. The air felt heavier. I walked back toward the sedan, slower this time. The pavement under my boots felt slightly uneven, though I knew that stretch of road well. I'd patrolled it for years. I could drive it blindfolded. But as I approached the driver's window, I noticed something else. The light angle had shifted. The cruiser's headlights hadn't moved. The spotlight hadn't moved. Yet the shadows of the grass and signpost were angled differently now. Only slightly, but enough. Enough to make my stomach tighten. The driver's window was still down. He hadn't turned away. Sir, I said, keeping my voice measured, are you aware you've been reported missing? His expression did not change. I'm here, he replied. That wasn't an answer either. Your family reported you missing 8 months ago. He tilted his head slightly, as if the concept were abstract. Did they? He said. Not a question, not quite a statement, just sound arranged into words. I felt a sudden urge to look down again. I did. The pavement was bright. The car's shadow lay firm and dark. The tires had clear outlines. The man's legs, visible beneath the steering wheel, cast nothing. My own shadow was still there, stretched behind me, attached. But when I shifted my foot, it seemed to hesitate. Just a fraction of a second. I blinked hard. Not real. Real. Not real. The driver leaned forward slightly. You saw me, he said softly. I didn't respond. You weren't supposed to, he added. My pulse ticked in my ears, slow and deliberate. Step out of the vehicle, I ordered. The words came automatically. He looked almost amused. Are you sure? He asked. The question felt weighted. I repeated the command. He opened the door, and as he stepped out onto the pavement, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. Up until that moment, I had only confirmed that he didn't cast a shadow in the cruiser's light. I had not considered what might happen when he stood between the headlights and me. He closed the car door gently, turned to face me fully, and under the full blast of white light, he cast a shadow. But it wasn't behind him. It stretched forward, toward me, long, thin, distorted, reaching across the pavement until it touched the edge of my boots. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down instinctively. My own shadow was still there, but thinner, lighter, as if something had begun to pull at it from the front. Not real. The man's shadow trembled slightly, even though he stood perfectly still, and I had the unmistakable feeling that it was not attached to him. I told myself it was the angle. Headlights do strange things on open roads. They stretch shapes. They bend proportions. They create illusions you don't question, because you know they're illusions. That's what I told myself while standing there, staring at a shadow that leaned toward me like it was curious. The man stood still. His body did not move, but the dark shape at his feet seemed unsettled, shifting slightly across the pavement as if testing its boundaries. Not real. "Keep your hands where I can see them," I said. He lifted them slowly, palms out. The gesture was obedient, compliant, almost theatrical. The shadow did not follow his hands immediately. It lagged behind, then adjusted. A fraction of a second too late, like it was learning him. I took a step back. The shadow stepped forward. My chest tightened. That wasn't possible. It had to be perspective. The cruiser's lights were fixed. I hadn't moved enough to justify that shift. I glanced down at my own feet. My shadow was there, but faint. Edges less defined than before. It used to look solid against the pavement. Now it looked diluted, as if someone had poured water into ink. Not real. "Sir," I said carefully, "turn around." He didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He turned his back to me, hands still raised. His shadow remained facing me. I felt the temperature change. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle drop. The humid Missouri air cooled enough that I could see a faint cloud of my breath when I exhaled. The man's breath was not visible. I noticed that too late. "Place your hands on the hood," I instructed. He stepped toward the front of the car. His body moved normally. His shadow dragged slightly behind, stretching unnaturally long before snapping back into place beneath him. I reached for my cuffs without thinking. Not because I had probable cause, not because he had committed a crime, but because my body was searching for control in a situation that had none. I needed something physical, something tangible, metal in my hand, rules I could follow. I approached him from the side, keeping distance from that length of darkness on the pavement. As I circled, the shadows shifted again, not matching the cruiser's light source, not matching the moonlight. It adjusted based on me. It leaned toward me. He kept his head forward. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said quietly. His tone wasn't threatening. It was almost regretful. "You were drifting across lanes," I replied automatically. He tilted his head slightly. I was waiting. For what? For someone who could see. The words didn't land like a confession. They landed like confirmation. Not real. I reached for his wrist to guide him closer to the hood. His skin was cold. Colder than the plastic of the license card. Colder than the air. He did not resist. But the moment my fingers wrapped around his wrist, the shadow at his feet jerked violently. Not across the ground. Up. It flickered upward like smoke caught in reverse gravity, then flattened again against the pavement. I stepped back instantly. My hand felt numb where I touched him. He turned his head just enough to glance at me from the corner of his eye. "You felt that," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't respond. I looked down again. My own shadow was thinner still. I shifted my stance deliberately. It followed, but slower than before. A delay, barely perceptible, but there. Not real. Real, not real. "Walk to the rear of the vehicle," I ordered. He complied. The shadow slid alongside him like a stain being dragged. When he reached the trunk, I stopped several feet away. I needed distance, needed the space between us to feel measurable. The highway behind me was empty. No headlights approaching, no distant glow of passing traffic. Just miles of black road and the hum of my cruiser's engine. I radioed dispatch again. "Confirm missing status," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. The response came slower this time. Static first, then silence, then a faint sound that was not part of any channel I recognized. Breathing. Close, in sync with mine, not real. Finally, dispatch answered. But their tone had changed. There was confusion in it. They said there was no active traffic stop logged for my unit, no plate check request, no license number submitted. According to their system, I had not initiated a stop. My stomach dropped. "That's not correct," I said. They repeated their information. They asked if I was feeling all right. I glanced at the man standing by the trunk. He was watching me now, fully, hands lowered, shadow pooled around his feet like ink spilled from a bottle. "I'm looking at him," I said quietly into the mic. "Looking at who?" Dispatch asked. At that exact moment, the sedan's headlights shut off. Not flickered, not dimmed. Gone. The cruiser's lights remained, red and blue still washing the scene. But the front of his car was now a dark shape in deeper darkness. I stepped back again. The man didn't move. His shadow, however, shifted forward another inch, then another, closing the gap between us. I looked down. My own shadow receded slightly, like it was being pulled toward him. "Not real, sir," I said sharply. "Step away from me." He smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I can't," he said. It sounded honest. He lifted one hand slowly and pointed at the ground between us. "Look, I didn't want to, but I did." The two shadows were nearly touching now. Mine faint, his dense and unnatural. As they met, there was no dramatic flash, no visible explosion, just a subtle merging at the edges, like two stains bleeding into each other on wet paper. I felt a pressure in my chest. Not pain, compression, like something had stepped closer inside my rib cage. I staggered back instinctively. My heel caught on the edge of the pavement. I nearly fell. When I looked down again, my shadow was no longer aligned with my body. It was slightly off to the right, detached by inches. I moved my arm quickly. The shadow hesitated, then followed, delayed. "Not real, real, not real." The man exhaled softly. "Better," he said. The word felt wrong in his mouth. I drew my weapon, not aimed directly at him, but low, ready. Training demanded action, control, containment. He didn't flinch at the sight of it. He simply looked at me with something close to curiosity. "You can't arrest this," he said gently. I felt the truth of that before I understood it. I glanced toward my cruiser. The red and blue lights seemed dimmer now, less authoritative, less real. The darkness beyond them felt closer, encroaching. The tree line behind him appeared thicker than before, as if the woods had leaned in. "Get back in your vehicle," I ordered. He tilted his head again. "You already stopped me," he said. The words were identical to before, repetition settling into something ritualistic, not real. I felt the ground tilt slightly, not physically, perceptually, like the world had shifted a degree off-center. My shadow drifted another inch away from my boots. His shadow surged forward, and for the first time since I'd stepped out of my cruiser, I realized something that cut deeper than fear. He hadn't needed me to stop him. He had needed me to see him. And now that something was beginning to transfer. I don't remember lowering my weapon. I remember holding it. I remember the weight in my hand. But when I try to replay the exact moment between standing there aiming low and standing there empty-handed, there's a tear in the memory. A gap. A few seconds were cut out and stitched back together wrong. Not real. Real. Not real. He was no longer by the trunk. That's the next clear thing I can say with certainty. 1 second he was standing near the rear of the sedan, shadow pooled thick at his feet. The next, he was inside the car. Door closed. Engine idling, as if he had never stepped out at all. My pulse was loud now. Too loud. I could hear it in my ears, in my throat. I looked down. My shadow was attached again. Mostly, it looked normal enough to pass a quick glance. But the edges were unstable. Slight ripples around the outline of my boots. I turned slowly, scanning the highway. Empty. The cruiser's lights still painted the world in red and blue, but the colors felt faded, washed thin. I walked back toward the driver's window, though I couldn't remember deciding to do that. The man was seated exactly as before, hands at 10 and 2. head angled slightly forward, waiting. The window was already down. "You stepped out of the vehicle," I said. It sounded weak, even to me. He smiled softly. "No," he replied. "You did?" "No, not aggressive, not mocking, just corrective." I felt my thoughts slowing, not clouded, slowed, like every idea had to wade through thicker air to reach the surface. "I saw you," I insisted. "You saw something," he said. The words settled in the space between us. I glanced into the interior of the car, still too dark. The dashboard lights were dim, unreadable. The rearview mirror inside the vehicle reflected nothing, not even the back window, just a blank gray absence. Not real. Real. Not real. "I need you to step out again," I said. He shook his head slightly. "You already did that." The phrasing was precise. I felt the ground tilt again, subtle but undeniable. My radio crackled. I flinched and grabbed the mic. Before I could speak, Dispatch's voice cut in. Except it wasn't dispatch. It was my voice. Calm. Measured. Reporting a routine stop. Giving the same mile marker. The same vehicle description. I froze. The version of my voice on the radio sounded steady, controlled, unaware. It continued speaking, confirming that the driver was cooperative, that everything appeared normal. I lowered the mic slowly. I hadn't said those words. Not now, not real, real, not real. The man watched my reaction carefully. "You're still there," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" I asked. He tilted his head again. "You're still at the beginning." My breath felt shallow. I looked down at my boots. My shadow flickered. Not from the lights, from within itself. A tremor across its surface, something moving beneath fabric. I stepped back abruptly. The shadow lagged, just long enough for me to notice. "You don't have to stay," the man said gently. "I'm not staying," I snapped. "You are." The words weren't confrontational. They were observational. I turned away from the sedan and walked toward my cruiser with deliberate steps. Each footfall felt heavy, as though gravity had increased slightly without permission. I reached the driver's door and paused. For a brief second, I hesitated to look down again. I didn't want to confirm what I was already feeling, but I did. My shadow reached the door before I did. It touched the cruiser's side panel first, then my hand followed. Not real, real, not real. I got inside and shut the door hard. The interior of the cruiser felt smaller, tighter. The dashboard lights glowed steady. The computer screen hummed faintly. I looked at the clock. The time read 1:17 a.m. I stared at it. I was certain it had been past 2:00 when I initiated the stop. I blinked. The clock flickered. 1:17 a.m. I glanced at the dashcam display screen. The live feed showed the sedan parked ahead, driver visible through the windshield. Still. Unmoving. I switched to playback. The screen buffered for a moment, then displayed footage of me stepping out of my cruiser for the first time, approaching the sedan, stopping halfway, standing still. For a long time, just standing there. The footage showed no driver in the car. The driver's seat was empty, the steering wheel untouched. I watched myself in the recording lean slightly to the left, then to the right, as if studying something invisible. Then I stepped back slowly and returned to the cruiser. That was all. No conversation, no interaction, no one inside the sedan. I felt cold, colder than before. I switched angles. Rear camera, the same. The sedan empty. Me speaking to open air, not real. I rewound. Paused at the moment I remembered him stepping out. The door never opened. The handle never moved. I felt my breathing shift, shallow and controlled. This was either a system malfunction or something worse. I looked up from the screen and out the windshield. The man was still there, watching me, hands on the wheel, smile faint. I swallowed. The computer pinged softly, an alert I didn't recognize. I looked down. A missing person file had opened automatically on the screen. Same name as the license, same photo. The status line, however, had changed. No longer missing. Now it read, located. Time of recovery, 1:17 a.m. Location, highway marker displayed. I stared at the timestamp, 1:17 a.m., the same time blinking on my dash. Not real. My heart pounded in my ears. The alert disappeared. The screen returned to the default patrol interface as if nothing had happened. I glanced up again. The sedan's headlights flicked on suddenly, blinding for a second. Then, steady. The man inside did not move. He simply waited. The red and blue lights from my cruiser felt weaker now, their reflection on the pavement less defined. My shadow inside the cruiser stretched across the dashboard. I lifted my hand. The shadow did not move. I froze. Carefully, I moved my hand again. The shadow lagged, then adjusted, like it was catching up. I felt something tighten inside my chest again. Pressure. Compression. As if an outline inside me was being traced and redrawn. Not real. Not real. The radio crackled once more. This time, dispatch's voice sounded distant. They asked if I needed assistance. They asked if everything was under control. I tried to respond. My voice came out delayed, echoing faintly behind itself. Yes, I heard myself say, but my lips hadn't moved yet. And when they did, the word arrived a half-second later. The man in the sedan nodded slowly, as if confirming a transaction. I understood then. Not fully, not logically, but instinctively. He hadn't been stopped by accident. He hadn't drifted by mistake. He had been searching for someone who could see. And now that the process had begun, I stayed inside the cruiser longer than I should have. Long enough for the engine's vibration to feel like it was syncing with something else. Not the road, not the tires. Something quieter, internal. Not real. Real. Not real. The sedan ahead of me remained perfectly still. Headlights on. Engine idling. Driver waiting. I watched him through the windshield and tried to measure what was left of the situation in procedural terms. Traffic stop. Driver possibly connected to an active missing person case. Dashcam malfunction. Radio interference. Those were manageable, those were reportable, those had forms attached to them. But none of them explained why the time on my dashboard refused to change. 1:17 a.m. The seconds did not tick forward. They did not tick at all. I leaned forward and tapped the screen as if it were frozen. It wasn't. The display responded to my touch. Menus opened, data shifted, but the time remained fixed. I checked my wristwatch, 1:17 a.m. My throat tightened. The man in the sedan lifted one hand slowly from the steering wheel and placed it flat against his window, palm out. Mirroring a gesture I hadn't made yet, I looked down at my own hands. They were resting on the steering wheel, both of them. I had not lifted one. Not real. My shadow on the dashboard had changed shape. It no longer aligned with the contours of my body. It leaned slightly toward the windshield, toward him. I pulled my hands away from the wheel abruptly. The shadow lagged, then followed. I reached for the door handle and stepped out of the cruiser again, forcing motion back into the scene. The air felt thinner now, like altitude without elevation. Each breath required attention. The red and blue lights from my cruiser were still flashing, but their rhythm felt slower. Or maybe I was slower. The sedan's headlights cut across the pavement in a steady white beam. I walked toward it. My boots struck the asphalt with a sound that felt distant from my body, like someone else was walking beside me in sync. I glanced down. For a moment, there were two shadows at my feet, one directly attached, one slightly offset, both mimicking my stride. Then they merged into one again. Not real. I reached the driver's window. The man's expression had softened. He looked less amused now, more patient. "Time doesn't move until it's finished," he said. I hadn't asked a question. "What's finished?" I managed. He tilted his head slightly. "You seeing?" I felt anger rise then. Not fear, not confusion. Anger, because it sounded like a riddle, like a performance. "Step out of the vehicle," I ordered again. My voice felt steadier now, anchored by frustration. He obeyed, slowly opening the door, stepping onto the pavement. And once again, he cast a shadow. But this time it was thinner, less defined, as if it had already given something away. I looked down at mine, darker than before, more solid. It stretched slightly toward him even though the light source hadn't changed. "You feel it," he said quietly. "Feel what?" "The weight." I did. There was a heaviness in my limbs. Not exhaustion, not weakness. Weight. As if my body had become denser, more anchored to the ground. He stepped closer. I stepped back. The two shadows touched again. No visible reaction. But I felt something pass between us. Not through skin, not through air, through outline. My chest tightened sharply this time. Not pain, not injury, just compression. Like something inside me had been outlined in ink, not real. "You were lighter before," he said. I swallowed. "What are you?" He considered that for a long moment. "Seen?" he replied. That answer unsettled me more than anything else he had said. Because it didn't sound evasive, it sounded factual. The cruiser's lights flickered behind me. I glanced back. The red and blue flashes skipped a beat, then another, then stabilized. When I turned back toward him, he looked different, subtly, edges sharper, features more defined, his posture straighter, his outline firmer against the night, as if contrast had been adjusted. I looked down at my own arms. They appeared slightly blurred at the edges, just faintly, like heat distortion rising off pavement, not real. "You were missing," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Yes, but you're here, yes." "Then who was missing?" He smiled gently. "You." The word didn't land like a threat. It landed like a correction. I felt the ground shift again, perceptual and slow. My radio crackled behind me. I didn't reach for it. I already knew what I would hear, my own voice. Reporting a stop, describing a drifting sedan, describing a driver who looked normal. I had been here before, not in memory, in repetition. I looked at the highway beyond him. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to register. There were no stars. The sky above the road was blank. Not cloudy, not overcast, just empty. A dark plain without depth. I turned slowly in a circle. The tree line looked flat, like a backdrop. The distance between objects felt compressed. The world had been reduced to the length of my headlights. Everything beyond that was suggestion. Not real. "You saw me," he said again. The repetition no longer sounded ritualistic. It sounded necessary. "You weren't supposed to," he added. "Then why were you there?" I demanded. He looked down at our shadows. "They drift," he said. "Who drifts?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back toward his sedan. His shadow did not follow immediately. It remained near my feet. Pooling, thickening. I felt a pull downward, not strong, but persistent, as if gravity had chosen a direction. My boots felt heavier, harder to lift. "You can go," he said softly. The offer sounded genuine, but I understood the implication. If I walked away now, if I returned to the cruiser and drove, I would leave something behind, or take something with me. I didn't know which was worse. The time on my dash would still read 1:17. The radio would still echo my voice. The file would still say located, not real. He opened his car door and sat down, engine still running, headlights steady. He looked at me one last time. "Thank you for stopping," he said. The phrase felt final, like a receipt. The sedan began to roll forward slowly. No abrupt acceleration, no screeching tires. Just a steady glide back onto the highway. I stood there, unmoving, watching. The car passed through the edge of my cruiser's flashing lights and vanished. Not faded into distance, not turned down a side road, vanished at the edge of illumination, as if the world beyond my headlights did not extend far enough to contain it. The highway ahead was empty again, completely. I looked down at my feet. There was only one shadow now. Solid, dense, perfectly attached. But when I raised my hand, it did not move. Not at all. I kept my hand raised longer than I should have. Long enough for the muscles in my shoulder to tremble. Long enough for doubt to try and correct what I was seeing. My shadow remained still on the pavement. Arm down, head forward. perfectly aligned with a version of me that wasn't moving, not real. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my arm. The shadow did not follow. It stayed frozen in that upright stance, hand still at its side. I swallowed. The cruiser's red and blue lights continued flashing behind me, washing the world in alternating color. Each pulse reshaped the pavement, the grass, the signpost, but the shadow at my feet remained steady, unaffected, dependent. I took one step backward. My body moved. The shadow did not. For half a second, I stood outside of it, my boots no longer aligned with its outline. Then, with a faint ripple across the asphalt, it slid backward and reattached itself to me. Perfectly placed, as if correcting a minor error. Not real. I felt something inside my chest tighten again. Not compression this time. Absence. A hollowing, like a room inside me had been emptied without my noticing. The highway ahead was completely dark, no sign of the sedan, no glow of taillights in the distance, no evidence that anything had been there at all. I turned slowly toward my cruiser. The flashing lights felt distant, less authoritative, less like something meant to protect, and more like something marking a perimeter, a boundary. I walked back toward it carefully, watching my shadow the entire time. Each step I took, it matched. Perfectly. No delay, no distortion. If I hadn't witnessed the hesitation earlier, I might have convinced myself it was normal. I reached the driver's door and paused. My reflection in the window looked intact. Uniform straight. Badge visible. Face pale but steady. Behind me, the shadow lay flat and obedient. I opened the door and got inside. The interior felt colder now. Not temperature. Weight, like the air inside the cruiser had settled lower. I looked at the clock. 1:17 a.m., still. Unmoved. The second digit did not flicker. The minute did not change. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I looked at my watch, 1:17 a.m. My pulse felt irregular, not fast. Uneven. I reached for the radio. "Dispatch," I said carefully. There was no response. I tried again. "Dispatch. Confirm status of traffic stop." Silence. Then, my own voice answered back. Clear. Measured. Dispatch. Routine stop. Everything appears normal. I froze. The radio continued playing my voice as if it were a recording on loop. Describing the drifting sedan. Describing the driver. Describing nothing unusual. The tone was calm. Unaware, I reached up and pulled the mic from my shoulder, holding it in front of me. The speaker was quiet now, but I could feel the vibration faintly in my hand, like something had just passed through it. Not real. I looked down at my hands. They appeared slightly darker than before. Not bruised, not stained, just heavier, like the light around them was absorbed instead of reflected. I flexed my fingers. The movement felt delayed, not physically, perceptually. As if I were watching myself from a fraction of a second behind, I glanced at the dashcam screen again. The sedan was gone, the highway empty. The footage showed me standing alone in the road, weapon lowered at my side, speaking to no one, then stepping backwards slowly, looking down repeatedly, as if checking something on the ground. The timestamp on the footage read 1:17 a.m., over and over. The same minute repeating across the bottom of the screen. Not advancing, not real, real, not real. I shut off the playback. The silence inside the cruiser deepened. I could hear my breathing clearly now, measured, controlled. But there was another rhythm layered beneath it. Fainter, not perfectly synced. Close enough to notice. I turned my head slowly toward the passenger seat. Empty. Nothing there, yet the sensation remained, like someone was sitting just outside my peripheral vision. I swallowed. I needed to test something. I opened the door again and stepped out into the flashing lights. The pavement looked normal, the grass still, the signpost casting its thin shadow. I stepped forward. My shadow followed immediately, perfectly aligned. I raised both arms at once. The shadow did the same. No delay. No distortion. I felt a strange relief. Maybe it had corrected. Maybe whatever had shifted had settled back into place. Not real. Then I stepped away from the cruiser's direct light, into the darker edge of the shoulder, where illumination softened. My shadow lengthened, thinned, and for a fraction of a second it did not belong to me. The posture was wrong. The head tilted slightly to one side, a familiar tilt. The same angle he had used when he studied me. I froze. My arms were at my sides. The shadow's head remained angled, watching. Then slowly, it straightened, mirroring me again. My breath caught in my throat. "You're still here," I whispered without meaning to. The words felt directed downward, not outward. The cruiser's lights flickered again. One skipped pulse. Then, two. The red light dimmed briefly, casting the world in a weaker blue. And in that brief imbalance of color, the shadow at my feet looked thicker than it should have, darker than the rest of the night, as if it carried depth. I felt something click into place inside my mind then, a realization that didn't come with explanation. He hadn't taken my shadow. He had given me his. The weight I felt, the density, the hollowed room inside my chest. It wasn't loss. It was addition. Not real. Real. Not real. I looked up at the empty stretch of highway again. It no longer felt like an open road. It felt like a boundary, like something had been sealed, and I was now the marker. I stood there under the flashing lights, staring at the pavement, feeling the darkness at my feet settle more firmly into place. It did not drift. It did not hesitate. It remained, patient, attached, waiting. I didn't drive away immediately. I told myself I was waiting for dispatch to clear the stop, waiting for the system to correct the time, waiting for something procedural to anchor the night back into something explainable. But the truth is, I was waiting to see if it would detach again. My shadow stayed close to my boots, while the cruiser's lights flashed over it in steady intervals. Each red pulse thickened it. Each blue pulse flattened it. The pattern became hypnotic, not real. I leaned down slowly and placed my hand into it. The pavement was warm from the engine and the summer air, but the space where the shadow pooled felt cooler, not cold, just absent, like touching a part of the world where light didn't fully commit. I pulled my hand back. The darkness snapped into its proper outline again, attached, obedient. I stood up straight and looked around. The highway was still empty. The sky above was still flat. The trees at the edge of the shoulder felt closer than they had before, their silhouettes sharper and more defined, like cardboard cutouts pressed toward the road. I walked back into the cruiser and shut off the light bar. The red and blue pulses died instantly. The world returned to a dim wash of headlights and darkness, and in that calmer light, my shadow deepened. It was darker now than it had ever been under the flashing lights. Dense, solid, almost dimensional. I looked at the clock again, 1:17 a.m., still unmoving. I reached forward and turned the ignition off. The engine died. The headlights shut down. The highway fell into near total darkness. Only the faint ambient glow of distant rural light pollution traced the horizon. For a moment, there was nothing. Just me and the night. I stepped out of the cruiser one last time. Without the headlights, the shadow at my feet should have faded. There was almost no light to cast it. But it remained. Not crisp, not defined by a clear source. Just present. A darker patch beneath me where darkness was already expected. Not real. I turned slowly in a circle. It turned with me, perfectly synchronized. No hesitation, no delay. I took a slow step forward. It matched. I took a slow step back. It matched. I lifted one arm. It lifted. There was no distortion now. No sign of misalignment. If someone had driven past at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just an officer standing alone on a quiet Missouri highway after a routine stop. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe cars passed. Maybe time moved. But I have no memory of it. The next thing I remember clearly is sitting at my desk at the station, writing the report. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly. The room smelled like paper and coffee. Ordinary, safe. My computer screen glowed steady. The incident form was open. I began typing. Routine stop. Vehicle drifting within lane. Driver cooperative. No citation issued. The words felt detached from what I had experienced, but they were the only ones that would fit into the available boxes. I glanced down at the desk. The overhead light cast a faint shadow of my hands across the surface. Dark, defined, attached. I moved my fingers slowly. The shadow followed immediately. No delay, no independence. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt watched. Not by someone in the room, by something aligned perfectly beneath me. Waiting, not real. A knock sounded faintly at my office door. I looked up. Another officer stepped in. He asked if I was all right. Said I'd been sitting there for a while. I asked him what time it was. He glanced at his watch. 1:17, he said casually. My stomach tightened. 1:17 what? He frowned. In the morning, I looked at the clock on the wall. 1:17 a.m. The second hand was moving. The minute hand had not. It hovered stubbornly between 1:16 and 1:17. Ticking without advancing, not real. The other officer asked if I needed anything. I told him no. He left. I stared at the wall clock for several more seconds, then slowly looked down at the floor beside my chair. The fluorescent light cast a clean outline of my body onto the tile. The shadow was perfectly aligned, head upright, arms at sides, still. I leaned forward slightly. The shadow leaned with me. I leaned back. It followed. Perfect. Controlled. And yet, for just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw it blink. Not movement, not distortion, just a subtle narrowing at the head, as if eyes had closed, then reopened. I froze. My own eyes felt dry. I didn't blink. The shadow remained unchanged, flat, ordinary. But the feeling inside my chest, the weight that had settled there on the highway, had not lifted. It had rooted, anchored, as if something inside me had found a place to stay. I looked back at the report on my screen. Routine stop. No citation issued. Driver cooperative. The cursor blinked at the end of the line. Waiting. I didn't know what else to add. There was no box for what I had seen, no field for transfer of outline, no checkbox for shadow discrepancy. I saved the report, closed the file, stood up from the chair. The shadow rose with me perfectly. I walked toward the door. It followed, steady, unremarkable. By the time I stepped into the hallway, everything looked normal. Other officers moving between rooms, phones ringing faintly in the distance, paperwork stacking up, the world intact. But when I passed beneath a different overhead light, for a single breath, my shadow did not appear at all. The tile floor beneath me remained evenly lit, empty. I stopped walking. The hallway noise continued around me. No one else reacted. Then, slowly, a shadow stretched into place at my feet, filling in, darkening, attaching, not real. I didn't mention it. I didn't report it. I went home at the end of the shift, parked in my driveway, stepped out of the car. The porch light flicked on automatically, warm yellow glow across the concrete. I looked down. There it was. Waiting. Still. And when I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, the interior lights cast it long across the living room wall. It did not drift. It did not hesitate. It did not detach. It simply remained. Closer than it had ever been before. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the faint streetlight outside filtered through the blinds. Thin stripes of pale light stretched across the walls, across the dresser, across the floor, across me. My shadow rested against the bedroom wall. Long, unbroken, perfectly shaped. Every time I shifted beneath the sheets, it shifted too. But it felt closer now, closer than the light source allowed, not real. Around 1:17 a.m., the digital clock on my nightstand blinked. It didn't change, it didn't reset, it blinked once. Then stayed at 1:17. I sat up slowly. The house was quiet, too quiet. No refrigerator, no distant car passing outside, just the faint rhythm of my breathing, and something else, a second rhythm layered beneath it. Close. Measured. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The shadow rose with me. But for a split second, it stood first. Then I did. I stared at the wall. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it had moved before I had. Not real. Real, not real. I walked into the hallway. The motion light clicked on overhead. A clean white glow spilled across the floor. My shadow formed instantly. Defined. Normal. I exhaled slowly. Maybe exhaustion was finally catching up to me. Maybe stress had carved strange shapes out of ordinary things. I stepped toward the bathroom mirror. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see my reflection. To confirm I was still centered, still whole. The light above the mirror flicked on. I looked at myself. Uniform gone. Plain clothes. Face pale. Eyes tired. Behind me, on the wall, my shadow stood. Attached. Unmoving. I lifted my hand slowly. The reflection lifted with me. The shadow followed. Perfect. Controlled. I let out a slow breath. Not real. Real. Not real. Then I leaned slightly to the left. The reflection leaned. The shadow did not. It stayed centered on the wall, head upright, watching. My breath caught. I straightened immediately. The shadow snapped back into alignment, as if nothing had happened. I stepped away from the mirror, turned off the light, walked back into the living room. The porch light outside still cast a warm glow through the window. My shadow stretched across the floor toward the front door, longer than it should have been. The angle was wrong. I stepped closer to the door. It stretched farther, thinner, reaching, not real. I stopped moving. It did not. For just a second, it continued to lengthen, extending toward the threshold, toward the thin line of darkness beneath the door. Then it settled, returning to its proper shape. I felt that compression again inside my chest, that anchored weight, like something had found its footing. I understood then, not logically, not with explanation, but with certainty. The man on the highway hadn't needed to be stopped. He had needed to be seen, and once seen, he had needed to be replaced. I walked slowly back to the center of the room and stood still, completely still. The shadow stood with me, perfect, attached, but I could feel it now, not outside. A density behind my ribs, a second outline layered over my own, waiting. The digital clock in the living room blinked faintly. 1:17 a.m. I looked down at my phone. 1:17 a.m. The minute had not changed. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, hours, maybe no time at all. Eventually, the porch light flickered once, twice, and went out. The room fell into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No outline, no shape, just black. Then slowly, a darker shape separated itself from the darkness at my feet, rising slightly, tilting its head. The same familiar angle, watching, not real. I did not move, because I understood something I wish I didn't. If I moved, it might not follow. If I moved, it might stay, and if it stayed, something else might drift. Somewhere out there, on a long stretch of Missouri highway, another patrol unit is driving a routine shift, watching for drift, watching for delayed corrections, watching for something slightly off. And when they see it, when they flip on their lights, when they step out of their cruiser and notice the quiet, they'll think it's just another stop, just another driver, just another shadow. If you're still watching this, look down. Right now, make sure yours moves when you do. And tell me, has the time changed where you are? Because mine never did. Not real. Real, not real. If this account disappears, you'll know why. Subscribe before the minute resets. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?